Buster, only thanks to All-Star Wine and Spirits with Armen and Levack on 104.5 The Team. And Buster, last night, Luis Severino had a pretty solid outing. Is he going to live up to the hype long-term?
I think so, and it's interesting that, the Yankees talked to a lot of different teams about a lot of different things, and other teams kept coming back to the same name, Luis Severino, and the Yankees said no. And I think that if they viewed him as being like a second or third tier guy, then they would have been willing to talk about him. But they don't. They think he's going to be a guy who's going to have a high impact, and we saw why last night in terms of the quality of his fastball, his ability to throw a breaking ball, which when you talk to Yankees evaluators, that has been a difference maker for him this year. And what he didn't really show in that first start was how good his changeup can be. But, when he puts all three of those pitches together, as he gains experience, he's going to have an impact. And they're asking him to have an impact right now, I think, through the end of the year. And they structured his season in such a way that he's got innings left as we come down the stretch. And he's going to keep getting the ball. He keeps throwing the way he did last night.
So you think he's going to stay in the majors the rest of the season?
That would be my guess.
Okay.
That's going to happen. And I think as we sit here today, put it this way, it's an open question as to whether or not he pitches in the minor leagues again.
Cool. Ooh, I like it. All right, Buster, the Yankees pretty quiet at the trade deadline. Did they cost themselves a postseason appearance?
I don't think so, because we talked about this going into the deadline, that they weren't necessarily compelled to do something because they have a nice little lead and a nice little advantage over the Blue Jays. Now, the Blue Jays were the team that did the most in terms of adding. They paid very heavily to get David Price and Troy Tulowitzki and augment, three other spots on their team, adding Ben Revere and two relievers. And they have become the team that no one wants to face in their home park. They look like a softball team, but the Yankees still have an advantage, and they're obviously a good team. And I think going forward, the whole issue with them is going to be the same as we've wondered all year. Can they stay healthy? Because they have a good bullpen, and they have a relatively deep lineup. And as long as you keep getting the sort of production they've been getting out of Alex Rodriguez and Mark Teixeira, I think they'll be okay. And we talked about this before. I mean, they have what going into the second half looked to be the easiest schedule in baseball, and I think they'll be able to really feast on that down the stretch.
Buster, only thanks to All-Star Wine and Spirits. Buster, did this season, as good as the Yankees are right now, did it kind of sneak up on Cashman? Did the Yankees think this team would be this good at this point?
I know from talking with Brian through spring training that, he felt like they had a chance to be pretty good because, in coming into the year, I picked them to be a wild card team because I was around them in spring training, and you saw, potentially how dominant that bullpen could be. And you saw that they had depth in their everyday lineup. And as we talked about, it's just the whole thing is about injuries. And so when you consider that was the biggest question, and Mark Teixeira hasn't missed significant time, and Alex Rodriguez has stayed healthy, and he's continued to be a productive player, and the only real major injury they've suffered in their everyday lineup has been to Jacoby Ellsbury. Yeah, I think that they thought if that was okay, then they would be okay. And I know from talking with Brian that even after Gregorius got off to a slow start, they thought that he was going to get better as the year's gone along. And my goodness, by the end of this year, when you use the stat wins above replacement, he may be 2.5 to 3 better than what they had last year with Derek Jeter, which is a significant upgrade.
Buster, the one trade the Yankees did make, bringing in Dustin Ackley from the Mariners, that's left a lot of fans scratching their heads.
They had, when I asked Brian about it, he mentioned that they had been working to get Ackley for 2 or 3 years, that they believed in his talent. Now, I assume that when they make a move like this, kind of like when they got Brandon McCarthy in the middle of 2014, that they get these players with something in mind. In other words, they feel like in their internal analytics that there's some sort of adjustment that could be difference-making for that player. And I asked that question, and I got a lot of, nah, we're not going to talk about it. But I don't think there's any question that they feel like that there's something that they can do with Dustin Ackley that's going to help him get better. Now, as you guys know, he's on the disabled list. He's got an issue, and we'll see if there's actually an opportunity there for the Yankees to try to do what they want to do with him. But I know that they got him with a specific idea in mind of trying to help him do something different. and that'll really push him forward. I mean, shoot, whatever they did with Brandon McCarthy last year with his cut fastball, it wound up making him about $48 million because, as you guys know, after they came to the Yankees, he was a completely different pitcher based on what Larry Rothschild had worked with him on.
Buster Olney, thanks to All-Star Wine and Spirits with Armen and Levack on 104.5 The Team. And Buster, you've been very adamant this week saying the Mets fan should stand up and take a bow.
No doubt about it, because I really believe that the pressure that came from, and I know this for a fact, that the pressure from the front office got from the fan base about adding help, and people calling into talk radio, and people complaining and responding at the ballpark the way that they did. That really drove the front office in a lot of the moves that they made. And, in the end, they wound up getting 4 pieces and 3 pieces for the everyday lineup, between Kelly Johnson and Juan Uribe and Yoenis Cespedes. And they wound up giving up a pretty good pitching prospect in Michael Fulmer to make it happen. And, we've seen not only did the Mets fans, were they difference makers, in terms of making moves, but then after the team started to turn it around, everything that happened with Wilmer Flores and that great weekend they had against the Nationals, the fans responded, and they came out and they filled up the ballpark, and it was almost like a message to the front office and the ownership of the Mets, hey, if you guys put a good product on the field, we'll come out and support it, and it feels like now the Mets are riding a wave that may take them right into the postseason.
So the Mets did enough right now in your eyes to win the NL East?
I think they're the team to beat as we sit here today, because the Nationals, the narrative on the Nationals all year has been, well, you know what, when they start to get some of their injured position players back, they'll turn it around. That hasn't happened. Ryan Zimmerman has not been the same, and Jason Worth, has been slow in coming back, and Anthony Rendon has started to hit better, but he certainly has not come back with a high impact. And some of that's related to the quality of the pitching they faced from the Mets and the Dodgers and some of the other teams they faced in recent days. But they seem to be fading in the standings, and it's been interesting. Bryce Harper the other day, after a loss, and he was talking about, I don't really care about the rest of the division. We got to take care of our own business. And then Jason Worth, the Phillies left fielder, coming out on Tuesday and saying, hey, you know what, this division's ours to win. I don't think that's the case anymore. Their rotation has certainly not been as good as they expected it to be, top to bottom, and their production hasn't been as good as they expected it to be. And the Mets right now are on such a roll and riding such emotion, I think, from the trade deadline, that it's now the Mets' division to win. And I think the question whether or not the Nationals can keep up with them.
Wow, Buster Olney with Armen and Levack. Thanks to All-Star Wine and Spirits on 104.5 The Team. And Buster, your counterpart Jason Stark said on Mike and Mike this week that the Mets have the best stuff in all of baseball, and you've told us that before. But He said the Dodgers have more experience. How much does experience matter with your starting rotation in October?
Well, as we've seen, it sometimes can mean nothing.
Right, with the Royals.
I mean, Clayton Kershaw is the best pitcher on the planet. If you had a draft of all the pitchers in baseball, he'd probably be the first guy taken, and he's been a disaster in October. So we saw with the 2003 Marlins, if you guys remember, those guys rolling through the Yankees, Josh Beckett at age 21 going into Yankee Stadium and dominating them, sorry, Levack, and crushing them in the way that he did. I could easily see a situation where the Mets became a really scary team for other people to face because it's just the pure stuff. I don't know if you guys got a chance to watch our Sunday night broadcast, the Mets game that they played against the Nationals, but I was chuckling the whole time because here you have Curt Schilling, who knows pitching far better than I would, and Syndergaard would throw a pitch, and all of a sudden, you'd hear from the booth where those guys were sitting, ooh, wow, because he's seen the quality of the stuff. And here's a funny but true story, and it's not wholly fair because to the Mets because Syndergaard has gotten better since the beginning of the year. But when you talk to other teams, they'll tell you among the starting pitchers that the Mets had at the beginning of the year, the guy who you could probably the trade target that the Mets are most willing to give up with was Noah Syndergaard. And think about that. When you're talking about, a staff that has Matt Harvey and Jacob deGrom and Zach Wheeler when spring training began, and the guy that you could trade for was Syndergaard, that tells you how much great stuff they have.
The big move they made for the offense is bringing in Cespedes. Fans for the Mets are starting a GoFundMe page to try to bring him back.
Yeah.
What's the likelihood that he actually is a Met long term?
All depends on whether or not they expand their payroll, because and whether or not the ownership feels compelled to push that number up. I mean, they started here with a $100 million payroll. If you're going to retain him, it's probably going to cost you $15 to $20 million a year. And we don't have any indication yet that the Mets are going to be willing to push up their payroll. And they do, they are going to be facing a situation in years to come when some of those starting pitchers are going to get more expensive. And if I were sitting in Sandy Alderson's shoes and my payroll, and my payroll limit was going to say, like, hold it at $110 million, I'd rather spend it on the pitching than I would on Cespedes, because that pitching is always going to be the great equalizer for them.
Buster Olney, thanks to All-Star Wine and Spirits with Armen Levack on 104.5 The Team. Buster, did the Blue Jays have a successful trade deadline of historic proportions?
I've heard that from reporters, and I'll balance it out by telling you this. I talked with people with other teams who believe that the Blue Jays made mistakes. That, it feels really good right now, but in the end, that the price that they gave up to get David Price and to trade for Troy Tulowitzki was too steep, given the payoff. Now, I don't know if I agree with that, because they haven't made the playoffs in 22 years, and you guys saw what happened in 2008 when the Brewers went all in with CC Sabathia. They still continue, even though they haven't made the playoffs but once since then, they still continue to draw really well in Milwaukee. Look at the impact that happened for the Kansas City Royals making the playoffs in Pittsburgh. And I think it would be the same in Toronto. And I tend to believe that if they actually break through and make it, that's of such importance to them that it's worth whatever extra price they paid. And there's no question about it. They have a complete team right now when you're talking about bullpen and you're talking about an everyday lineup that no one wants to face, and their home field advantage, and Price being a guy who can, start a playoff game for them. And then, of course, yesterday we heard the possibility that Marcus Stroman now looks like he's going to be back in a relief role sometime in September. So the Jays bullpen goes from being a real question mark to now, between the addition of LaTroy Hawkins and Mark Lowe and, having Aaron Sanchez in that group and Marcus Stroman in that group, to being a potential strength once we get to October.
Buster, who's the team that just completely whiffed at the trade deadline?
Padres. It is. I just, still astonished to this day. Like, within the first hour before the end of the trade deadline and the first hour after, I'm getting texts from people with teams saying, really? They're not going to do anything? Because at that moment, guys, there were 7.5 games out for the race for the second wild card team. And as of, when you and I are speaking, there's still 7.5 games out in the race for the second wild card team. They haven't really made up any ground, and they have so many impending free agents. They have such a terrible farm system because of all the trades they made last winter, and they have huge holes for next year. Shortstop, third base, center field, 2 spots in the rotation, and it looks like they're not going to get any value in trade for their free agents. And I'll make the comparison to if they were playing a game of poker. It was like they had a pair of 5s, and everyone else at the table is representing aces, kings, and queens, and the Padres were like, oh, yeah? Well, you know what? We're going to double down our bets. It just didn't make any sense at the time they did it, and that's what I kept on hearing from people with other teams. And I do think that if the Padres were to somehow come back and make the postseason, that at that point we would give the Padres credit for making a great gamble. But if they don't make the postseason, and I think their chances are literally 3 or 4% based on the numbers that are in front of them, then we're going to look at it as maybe the classic example of strategic stubbornness by a front office unwilling to admit that they made mistakes during the winter.
Buster, couldn't help but notice Levack hasn't asked you this question today.
Hey, I think you're busy. You gotta go.
I think I know why. Who's the better team, Mets or Yankees?
I'm going to surprise you and say that I think right now it's a coin flip. Woo! If you ask me today which team has a better chance for success in postseason, than I would say the Mets do because of that dominant starting pitching.
Wow. Hey, 10 seconds. The names to watch on the waiver wires?
Mike Napoli of the Red Sox for sure. I think that those Padres guys we mentioned, Ian Kennedy, and an interesting guy to watch is Chase Utley, because the Phillies, clearly at this stage are playing out the string. They have a second baseman. Chase doesn't have real future with his team. And so I think Chase at some point's got to decide, does he want one last shot at the playoffs, or does he want to play his entire career with the Phillies?
Buster, have a great weekend, man. Thanks.
See you guys.
Buster Olney, thanks to All-Star Wine and Spirits on Latham Farms.
Yes.
Levack and I love All-Star Wine and Spirits for multiple reasons. And Levack, I'm going to choose one here. The reason why I love All-Star Wine and Spirits, I'm going to bring up right now, is because Baby Munchie loves All-Star Wine and Spirits. Because Baby Munchie walks in the store and she is mesmerized for a good half hour, which is great for me. I get time to shop. She loves the fish tanks. There are over 6 fish tanks around All-Star Wine and Spirits, including the largest wine bottle aquarium in the country. They have bearded dragons there, and her favorite part are the dogs that are walking around. All-Star Wine and Spirits is great for the kiddos.
I'm going to agree, kind of. I also love it because I'm a dad, and everybody knows the headaches that come with being a dad. So nice Friday, Saturday night unwinding with a little Jack and Coke in my glass. Thank you, All-Star.
All in the family at All-Star Wine and Spirits and Latham Farms, allstarwine.com. Go tell them Armen Levack sent you at All-Star Wine and Spirits.